You may be seated.
So many of us already know this story. We know he was unjustly judged. We know Jesus was tormented. We know Jesus was crucified. We even know that Jesus was resurrected. So why come here today? Why come to hear this story one more time? Well, we come, I think, in part to give thanks to God for this, but also we come together as a community to renew our hope. We remember the story, yes, but we forget that this resurrection story is as relevant for us, for you, for each of you here today, as it was for the people in their story, for the women at the tomb, for Jesus' mother, for Peter. So do you, as you are sitting here right now, know of the hope that this resurrection story has for you today? To know the hope that it has for us today, we're invited to remember not just the story, not just the resurrection itself, but what it gave. And what it gave was hope to those first Easter people. So now I invite you to remember, just as the women at the tomb were invited to remember. The women, they must have walked to the tomb with so many emotions swirling through them. Can you even imagine what they were feeling? So dejected, so sorrowful, so bereaved, even confused. Yet they knew they had to prepare his body despite what they were feeling. And I know many of you know what that feels like. Just have something to do to put the grief at bay. Keep yourselves busy so you wouldn't have to acknowledge all the grief you are feeling. Just keep moving forward. Do what you need to do. Don't acknowledge all those feelings that are in you right now. But when they get to the tomb, all that busyness that they were hoping to do just stopped because they found the stone rolled away. Now shock enters the mix of their emotions, and they tentatively walk into the tomb and realize Jesus' body is not there. Add surprise and confusion to their emotions. And if that's not enough, out of nowhere, two angels described as men in dazzling white clothes show up. Now they're terrified too. Can you imagine? They must have dropped all the spices that they were carrying and just froze. There are more emotions right in that day that these women faced that any of us will face in any one day. Certainly we'll face them in different days and different phases of our lives. But in that one moment, grief and surprise and wonder were all happening at the same time. And the advice the angels gave to them was to remember. Just remember. Remember what Jesus told you. Remember Jesus told you this would happen. He told you this would happen. He told you he would rise again. If you were here last week, we talked about that word remember. And we talked about it as actually imagining a dash between the word re and the word remember. Remember, put together whole again. And that is exactly what happened with the women. They remembered. They remembered that Jesus did tell them that he was going to rise again. And they were put back together. They felt whole again. Their hope was renewed. And the first thing that they wanted to do after their hope was renewed was to renew the hope of others. And I think hope is like that. Hope is infectious. Hope is something that you want to spread. Not the superficial kind of hope. Not the hope built on promises that are false, but the hope that comes from the promises of God. that God will always, always do what God has promised God will do. The women, they remembered, and they wanted others to remember too. They wanted the apostles to move from that space of feeling disappointment to feeling disjointed. They wanted the apostles to remember and become whole again. And so they run to the apostles and they tell the story to the apostles, but they were too focused on their disappointment. They were too focused on their loss, which is understandable. Sometimes we just need to sit in our losses. But then there is Peter. And throughout our Lenten period, we've been following Peter's journey. We know that Peter had been through a lot. He started his journey with Jesus feeling ashamed. If you remember when Jesus first meets him and he recognizes that Jesus is Lord, he is so ashamed. He says, "Go away from me, Lord." And yet Jesus still invites him to be a disciple. Oh, he's had his high moments and he's had his low moments with Jesus. But what must have been on his mind the most in those last few times is the guilt he felt. Because on the night when Jesus had his Last Supper with the disciples, Peter, as always, talked a big talk. Peter talked about walking with Jesus during his upcoming ordeal. "Oh no, me, Jesus? I'm going to walk with you through it all. I'm going to be there for your trial. I'll even go to prison for you." But Jesus knew better. Jesus told Peter that he would deny him 3 times. And I think Peter maybe still didn't believe that Jesus was going to go through all this stuff. Peter maybe secretly still had that idea of what the Messiah was supposed to be. He even said he would die with Jesus. But just as Jesus had predicted, Peter denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. And he did it at the very initial stages of Jesus' trial, when Jesus had been taken away and they first recognized Peter. That must have made him feel so ashamed. It looked as if his discipleship would be ending in the same way it began, in shame. And one might think Peter could perhaps walk away, hide away, slink away in shame, that he said he would be with Jesus and instead denied him. But this Peter is a very different Peter than the Peter who first started his journey with Jesus. This Peter has witnessed Jesus' love and grace. So when Peter hears the women tell the story, he doesn't dismiss their testimony as idle talk like the other disciples did. No, he listens and he embraces it. So imagine with me right now. Imagine that we can hear Peter's voice firsthand. Imagine with me how Peter might tell this story of hope. Imagine I am Peter now telling this story firsthand. It's still dark, but the light is just beginning to stretch its fingers across the sky. The light is just beginning to touch the edges of the world. But I barely notice. See, I thought I knew what darkness was, but what I'm feeling now is a different kind of darkness. This is a kind of darkness that wraps around you tighter and tighter until you cannot tell where this darkness ends and where this darkness begins. Because this darkness is a darkness in the absence of him, of Jesus. And I had failed him. When I look back how I spent my last few hours before he died, I am ashamed. We had 3 years together. And in some ways, those 3 years, they flew by. And in other ways, it was a lifetime. I will never forget when we first met, that miraculous abundance of fish. I will always remember how he took away my sense of unworthiness and shame. He called me, a nobody, to be his disciple. And throughout our years together, I was blessed by him and I was corrected by him. And I will never forget witnessing Jesus go from place to place, Witness him reach out to the outcasts. Witness him healing and listening to and teaching, telling people that they are all God's chosen people. He talked about God's kingdom being for all people. And he did more than talk about it. Jesus lived it. He was so gracious to everyone. The way he broke bread with anyone, regardless of income or status. The way he defied the religious rulers who deemed us unworthy. The way he invited us, a group of people who would normally never get along, to come together and to work together. Me, a fisherman, working alongside a tax collector and a zealot. All of us working together with the hope of a world where all people are loved by God equally. All people living freely. Such hope. But now here we are, and we're all alone. And I find myself asking why, over and over again. But then light breaks into the darkness. A flurry of activity. A group of women enter the room and they're talking all at once, and I can make out some words in between the gasps of breath as they are doubled over. Stone moved, tomb empty, angels not there, risen, remember what he said. And in the background, I can hear the other men dismiss the women. Nonsense, idle talk. You're being hysterical, women. But a sliver of light shines through the darkness. And I do remember what he said, and I do remember what he promised, and hope, it surges. My feet carry me before my brain can even fully engage, and I rush towards the impossible. Please, please, please. And I hope, and I hope, and I hope, and I hope that this is true. And there it was. Just as they said, just as he promised, empty, except for his burial clothes. And it's hard to me to explain. It's as if Jesus was saying to me, I am risen, I am alive, just as I said. But leave your shame, leave your guilt, leave your sin behind, just as I have left my burial cloths behind. Have hope in this new life. And I stand there, a mess of confusion and bursting joy. I've never felt so lost and found in one moment. It was as if every mistake, every denial, everything I had ever uttered was magnified, but also erased at the same time by the enormity of the emptiness that stood before me. He is alive as he had promised. This hope, this is not some flimsy, wishful promise. This is a hope that God had said God would do, and this hope is solid and unbreakable. The kind of hope that anchors you, not just for a moment, but for eternity. Jesus had spoken of this, and he had told us this time and time again, but it was like trying to describe a color you've never seen or a song you've never heard. Until you see it, until you hear it, until you understand it, you cannot describe it. But I have seen hope, and his name is Jesus. And in that moment, I realized this hope wasn't just for me. It's for all of us. He overcame oppressive powers. He did not let violence or hatred have the final word. He rose again for the broken, for the lost, for the ones who denied him. And he did it not just with words, but with actions. He did it for all those who live lives in the shadows. This hope is a beacon calling us home, calling us to a love so vast and so deep that it could even overcome death. So what now? Now I tell the story. Now we tell this story. We spread this hope like wildfire. We live like we're truly alive for the first time because in a way we are. We've been given a second chance. Not just a life, but a life of love, a life of forgiveness, a life where everything that matters has come to light. And me, I'm just Peter, a simple fisherman who's seen the impossible, a man who's known the deepest darkness, who felt like the biggest failure. And still, I dared to run towards hope because I remembered his promise. I have been witness to the dawn of unending hope. And it's a dawn that never fades and a light that never dims because he is alive. And that changes everything forever. You know, Peter's stories is one that has so much hope for all of us. It tells us that even after we feel like the biggest failures, even after the worst case scenario we think has happened, we can still run towards God with hope. So my question is, like Peter, will you still keep running towards that hope? Will you still keep looking for God, the hope of God, in the midst of when you feel like utmost failure or an utmost in a moment of despair? And the resurrection story says, yes, keep looking. The hope for you today is just the same as it was for them. Yes, God is still present in the darkness. Yes, God keeps God's promises. God is a God who takes away our sins and our shames, our failures, and reshapes them. He says, leave them in that tomb. God took what seemed like the ultimate final thing, death itself, and reversed it. Not just after a few minutes, but after 3 days. So let's just sit with that. Let's not analyze it or theorize about it or theologize about it. Let's not debate the whys and hows about it. Let's just run towards that with hope. Peter did, and he left amazed. So just take that in. In this world, we want to overanalyze and we want to strip the mystery out of everything. We want to take away the awe out of everything. It's as if we can explain everything, then we have control over everything. And the truth is, we don't and we won't. We might just end up dejected. So instead, just let the awe and wonder of this story transform you. Let the renewed hope of Peter and the women at the tomb be your hope. Let it transform you from the inside.